Welcome everyone at home. We are in that moment where we're going to give people just a couple of seconds for their computers to get connected so that they don't miss any of the good information that we have this evening to share with you. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Kathleen Christ, and I'm the Executive Director of Houston Area Parkinson's Society. And I want to welcome everyone to our Community Partners Presents program. This evening, we are going to be talking about adaptive deep brain stimulation with our community partner, Medtronic. And for those of you who are familiar with this webinar series, you know that this is a program that we started in 2020 because you all wanted to learn more about the growing options with regard to treatment for Parkinson's. So we know a lot about Parkinson's. We know that we also have a lot of treatment options, both pharma and device oriented. And so that means that it's really important for you all to be the best consumers and so that you can make informed decisions and have good conversations with your physicians about the types of treatments that are right for you and when it is the right time for those options. So tonight we are partnering with Medtronic. I'm going to kick it over to them in a moment to introduce your speaker, Dr. Bellows, who is a member of the HAPS Medical Advisory Board and who we are always so happy to have present for us. But as you know, this is a sponsored content session. If you have joined one of these before, you know that you are more than, welcome during the course of the conversation to enter your questions in the Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I know some of you are more comfortable texting your questions, and so some of you have phone number and email that you can text or email. I'll be going through all of those while Dr. Bellows is presenting, and then he and I will come back and we will make sure that we get your questions answered. We are recording this evening's presentation. We don't always get the opportunity to record, but Medtronic has given us permission to do that this evening. And so we will have this recorded that you can go back. We'll archive it on our YouTube channel, and then you'll be able to go back and watch it again when it is up and available. So with that, I just want to say welcome, and I'm going to turn this over to Judd Hightower with Medtronic, who is going to introduce your speaker, and then I will see you on the other side of Dr. Bellows' presentation. Judd?
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. Very exciting webinar tonight. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Stephen Bellows, who is the Assistant Professor of Neurology, one of the Assistant Professors of Neurology within the Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Clinic at Baylor College of Medicine. So very honored to have him discuss with you a very novel option for deep brain stimulation. And with that, thank you again for joining, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Bellows. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you all as well for the opportunity to get to talk to you guys as far as adaptive DBS. It is a definitely very interesting and exciting novel application and kind of methodology change to what we're used to for deep brain stimulation. So I'm really happy to be able to give kind of an overview. For this talk, it's kind of divided sort of into two parts. There's actually a fairly recently released study called the ADAPT PD study, as you can see here. That was one of the larger series to look at the results and clinical outcomes for folks using adaptive DBS. So the first part of the presentation kind of goes into those studies' results, which we'll discuss. And then we talk about the adaptive DBS process in general, and particularly including how it's reading signals to adapt to and the methodology of such. So diving right in. First, just kind of some quick terminology. You'll hear obviously us saying adaptive DBS a lot during this. We can typically think of the kind of two different modalities near as continuous DBS or adaptive DBS. You might also hear this as being an open loop or closed loop system. Continuous DBS, meaning that you're sending a tonic stimulation or just this continued signal pattern over and over to the target. And this is an open loop, meaning that we set these parameters. It's typically a train of these square wave pulses, and you program how big they are, how wide they are, how frequently they're going, but it's doing the same pattern each time, and it's not changing after it's been programmed by the physician. In contrast, adaptive DBS is using signals from the brain to change the signal at any given point, depending on what it feels is needed. So the size of the stimulation can be at a certain amperage or a certain value. And then depending on these signals that we're reading, it can turn it up or down, depending on what the signals show and what presumably is indicating what kind of stimulation a patient needs. So if the signals are indicating that a patient's symptoms are worse, then ideally we like to turn up the stimulation to compensate during those times, and then turn down a stimulation if the signals are indicating that the patient's symptoms may be better. So that's really the whole point of the adaptive DBS is using this kind of signal from the brain to adjust the amount of stimulation rather than just having this single pattern firing constantly. The journey over to adaptive DBS or ADBS has, taken a little bit. It's really been first started in 2012 with some of the first conversations with the FDA about brain sensing research. Some of the initial research involved this Activa primary cell plus sensing PC plus S research, primarily over in California. Further divisions were or discussions were had with the FDA as far as pre-submissions. The ADAPT PD trial was generated and started in July 2020 with patients enrolled in December 2020. Completion of the trial resulted in regulatory submissions last year. And then in 2025 was the FDA approval and the starting of clinical availability for adaptive DBS in the US. And so really very kind of new modality that has only just recently become available for folks. This is kind of an overall summary of the ADAPT PD study results. We'll go over each of these in actually a little bit of turn, so don't worry about, trying to memorize every single facet on this particular slide. Uh, the ADAPT PD trial was a open label, uncontrolled trial in regards to adaptive DBS, where they compared the continuous DBS settings for folks to either a single or dual adaptive DBS program from there. When they were switched over to adaptive DBS, they did a single blinded crossover trial where they were selected on one adaptive program and then crossed over to the other adaptive modality, which we'll talk about a little bit here later too as well. And mostly they compared the results between the two different ways you can do adaptive DBS compared to the effects of the continuous DBS. The primary outcome for the trial was really a non-inferiority trial. So, was there any loss of on time without troublesome dyskinesia in more than half of the folks? And the study met its primary outcome that showed that there was not significant loss of on time, and so that there was a non-inferiority as compared to the standard continuous DBS. And it did actually show some improvements in on time numerically, which I'll go into a little bit more detail a little bit later on. Um, the shows on the top left, this figure, as far as the efficacy, the goal that we're trying to reach is more than half of the subjects had this non-inferiority measure. And it showed that both modes, the single threshold and dual threshold mode, we'll go into more detail in just a little bit later, but essentially these both ways of doing adaptive DBS both met the primary goal. They also looked at the energy efficiency of the device to see if there was any savings in energy with the adaptive DBS as compared to continuous DBS. There is some significant savings with the single threshold mode. No difference with the dual threshold mode, but not worse either from that standpoint. And then they have some other additions as far as safety, patient experiences, and some specific on-time numbers that we'll go into in a little bit more detail. So this figure is showing with the study the overall change in on time without troublesome dyskinesia. So when you're looking at any really Parkinson study, but particularly for DBS, this is kind of one of the main measures is when can you have this good on time when the medication is working and there's not dyskinesia that are causing issues. That means you're overshooting the target. This is showing the two different modes that they tested, this single threshold and this dual threshold. And they're really trying to show, again, non-inferiority, that patients, at least 50%, so the majority of patients, did not lose more than 2 hours of this on time without dyskinesia, troublesome dyskinesia. And this graphic shows that the majority did meet these on both of these ones. 83.3% of the single threshold mode and 92.1% of the dual threshold mode showed that they had this measure for equivalent function, essentially. And that actually the majority showed some improvement in on time as well, numerically zero point 0.6 hours in the single threshold, and then numerically an average of 1.3 hours in the dual threshold. Kind of going into that a little bit in more detail. Again, this is talking about the single mode and the dual mode. This shows changes in off time and changes in on time without troublesome dyskinesia. For the single threshold, they showed a numerical reduction in zero point 0.7 hours of the day of off time, and then an improvement of zero point 0.6 hours of the day in on time without troublesome dyskinesia. In dual threshold, they showed a reduction in 1.6 hours for the day in off time, and then an improvement in 1.3 hours of the day in on time without troublesome dyskinesia. So numerically, there does look to be a benefit for these. Importantly, the statistical significance was significant for the dual threshold and not for the single threshold. But numerically, they showed at least some improvement here. And then on the dual threshold, it was statistically significant for both of these measures here too as well. So, when looking at ADAPT-PD, you can look at other kind of prior historical trials where they showed on time and hours, and showed that with previous DBS trials back in 2009 and 2013, they were typically looking at an average amount of on time of about like 10.9 to 12.4. And you can see that ADAPT is in a similar range, numerically a little bit even higher from that standpoint, and that off time is also in a similar range as compared to previous DBS on time trials, with numerically some further improvement from that standpoint. So showing that there was further improvement numerically in some of these on time and off time features as compared to these previous trials. When looking at folks, there was a preference for continuing with adaptive DBS into the long-term follow-up. When looking at people who were able to be programmed into the adaptive DBS settings, which was 45 of the participants, after they finished the trial and the monitoring period, 44 of those 45 patients chose to continue with an adaptive DBS program for further long-term follow-up. And one of those 45 patients decided to continue with a continuous DBS program. Of these patients, the ones who preferred adaptive DBS were 66% were pleased with the way that it addressed fluctuations, so the wearing off of their medication. 63% felt that it improved their motor symptoms in general, not just wearing off, but more of a motor symptoms throughout the dosage. And 45% preferred how side effects were being managed on the adaptive DBS as compared to the continuous DBS. Um, Definitely a lot of folks who had a positive fear experience with adaptive DBS. This 98% doesn't necessarily include some other folks who had some difficulty with tolerating adaptive DBS when they were doing the programming and converting people from continuous to adaptive DBS, but is primarily including the 45 patients who were able to tolerate the initial adaptive DBS switch. But even including those folks who dropped out during the transition from continuous to adaptive DBS, it works out to about 85% of folks uh, preferred continuing with adaptive DBS in the long-term follow-up. When you're looking at the safety monitoring profile, there's a list of adverse events throughout the trial. The most common adverse event noted was the worsening of Parkinson symptoms, noted in 22% of events. And I mean, that's pretty expected with really any kind of trial where you're adjusting DBS settings, where we're going through adjustments in the DBS and trying to tweak and optimize any new setting, let alone using a adaptive threshold. Certainly not uncommon for there to be worsening DBS or Parkinson's symptoms until we're able to really get to a good program that adequately treats someone's symptoms from that point. During the evaluation phase for the adaptive DBS, after they finished the setup and the adjustment, there was resolution of all the adverse events that were determined to be related to the device. And then in the enrollment up until the end of the long-term follow-up, there really weren't any serious adverse device events that were noted here too as well. As also a quick definition, this is really more of a clinical trial terminology. When you talk about adverse events in a clinical trial, it's really anything bad that happens in a clinical trial. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to the actual agent you're studying or whatever you're doing there. Is something adverse happens, you're supposed to record it. So the always classic example is somebody's in clinical trial, they're walking out the door, they go home and they trip on a root on the ground or they trip on like something that's left in the yard and they fall and have an injury. You would still mark that injury as an adverse event because it occurred during the trial. If you were trying to determine if it's related to the investigational agent, you would say no, it's not related, but you still need to call it as an adverse event. So similarly in this trial, with the total of 85 participants from the beginning and these data, there were 70% of the adverse events were deemed not related to the adaptive DBS protocol. When looking at the event types that were seen in the adaptive DBS, it's pretty similar actually to continuous DBS as far as different types of events and measures of events that we see. Again, the most common adverse event we saw was really the 22% of worsening PD symptoms, and then some difficulty tolerating adaptive DBS in two participants. And then really the majority of device-related adverse events were able to be resolved throughout the evaluation and the setup and adjustment phase, except for one device-related adverse event in the setup. So really just a long way of saying that things were tolerated well and as expected from a DBS standpoint and compared to prior DBS trials. One thing that's mentioned these ones too, and it's certainly an interest to Parkinson's patients and Parkinson's trials, is falls. There were a relatively small number of falls that were related to the adaptive DBS, but this was clocked to be 4 out of a total of 88 falls that were in the entire study. Again, they're marking every fall that happens as a potent or as an adverse event and potential relationship, but only 4 were deemed to be related to the adaptive DBS as determined by the investigator and then a clinical events committee, and not actually through Medtronic itself, which is also pretty standard for a clinical trial protocol. Um, and actually, the rates of falls that they saw in the trial were lower than typical normal fall rates you would expect in Parkinson's disease as well, too. And as really with other safety events, these were discussed at the FDA prior to the approval of adaptive DBS as a therapy option for Parkinson's disease. Um, Another question that came out the trial, they were looking at the energy delivery and trying to see if there was any impact on the battery longevity. Um, and they looked at the different modes that you can use as well. For the dual threshold mode, it did show an improvement of about 5% per year of battery longevity. For the single threshold mode, it showed an average loss of 4% battery longevity per year. And then using continuous DBS plus brain sense, which is where you're reading the signals, but you're not actually adjusting the DBS to those signals, costs about an extra 3% per year. So depending on which mode, looking at either, a loss of 4% to a gain of 5% battery per year. So not really a huge change or huge swing on either modes from that point. Of note, adaptive DBS is also available on the rechargeable versions of these. So it only does have a rechargeable one that's still going to be graded for the same 15 years of longevity. Any kind of difference in battery life is really going to mostly just affect how frequently you may have to charge the device, not how long the battery is going to be good for. So, in summary, some of these findings for clinical outcomes, they showed that on time was overall stable to continuous DBS, so non-inferior. And then on some of the secondary analyses, they showed that there was a significant improvement in on time without troublesome dyskinesia of 1.3 hours per day in the dual threshold mode, which also met the definition of a clinically meaningful gain, meaning that there was enough on time that most patients would notice the difference with this increase in on time. Um, for those patients who had switched over to the adaptive DBS, many of them, the vast majority did stick with adaptive DBS and preferred to continue that long-term follow-up. 98% of the folks who were able to tolerate adaptive DBS, and then about 85% of folks who were trying to transition from continuous DBS. Um, Both modes were safe, with safety profiles similar to current labeling for deep brain stimulation. And again, a very large proportion, 87%, that 45 out of 52 were able to be set up on that adaptive DBS. Um, and the reason this trial is particularly important is because it is really the first chronic adaptive DBS study with really a larger patient population from the standpoint. And it includes both subthalamic nucleus and GPI targets as well. So it helps to add some generalizability to both of these targets, which we'll use in folks with Parkinson's disease. The first to compare the two different modes we have for adaptive DBS, and then also the first one which used directional stimulation as a potential modality for the programming for these folks. And so again, here are some different figures, again, showing the 1.3 hours of increase on time, the 5% increase in battery life for the dual threshold mode, and then again, about a 4% loss for the single threshold mode. Um, Many of the patients choosing to remain in adaptive DBS from 85 to 98%, depending on where you look in this trial. Reduction in PD meds for some patients, and then adds this nice option that's available to help treat Parkinson's symptoms. And it's really an interesting facet of closed loop DBS that should only continue to have some further expounding on the capabilities and what kind of signals we're able to sense and how we're able to modulate based on those signals as the time is coming. So, talking about the different thresholds that I keep throwing about here, we're talking about single threshold versus dual threshold. We're really talking about how the device is deciding to turn itself up or down. This is a graphic about what it looks like on the tablet when we're programming it. For this part of the programming, we're typically what we do is streaming. So we're actually reading live the electrical fields that are coming from the brain. And we're seeing the DBS adapt in response in real time to those signals. So if you see at the top of the screen, this little bar that says LFP, that stands for local field potential. And that's what we're reading from the brain. And we're going to go into that in more detail. But essentially, we're reading if it's going high or low. And if it's going high, that is when we expect the symptoms to be at their worst. If it goes high enough past a single threshold, this kind of dotted line that's set right there, that's when we are asking the DBS to turn on. So you can see right here with the LFPs, it goes high, it stays high above that threshold for a predetermined amount of time. Down here is the stimulation amplitude. You can see it ramping up. It's a high amplitude. The stimulation or the field goes down below that threshold, and the stimulation ramps down in response. So that's that closed loop is the increase in stimulation when it reads that the signal is high, and then the decrease in stimulation when it reads that the signal is low. It's not turning off here, by the way. It's actually between these two different levels you can set a lower amplitude level and then a higher amplitude level. So there's customizability about which levels you want to switch it over to. In contrast, for dual threshold mode, as the name implies, there's actually two thresholds, a lower threshold and an upper threshold. It's a bit more slowly responsive, and the goal is to essentially kind of keep the signal within the thresholds you're setting there. So again, you're trying to turn the device up when the signal is high, and then you're trying to press it down when the signal is low. So if the signal gets elevated here, where it's above this upper threshold, you're telling the device to turn on. So you can see that it's elevated up here for a period. The device catches that it's elevated and it's kind of slowly ramping up this stimulation to compensate. As the stimulation ramps up, the signal is decreasing from the stimulation, and the signal hits into the target area between this upper threshold and this lower threshold. And then the stimulation levels off because you're now at the target goal. So it's kind of more of a slowly adaptive compared to the single threshold where you're really trying to hit inside this lower limit and this upper limit, which again, you have a lot of flexibility to assess what the limits are, the stimulation to get there, how quickly and how slowly you want the stimulation to ramp up to really meet each individual patient's needs. Alrighty, so talking about local field potentials, again, this is the signal that we're looking at to determine when we need to turn the stimulation up and down, and as a marker for how somebody's symptoms might be going on in any individual moment. So for LFP signals, we're primarily looking at this thing called the beta frequency, which I'll show you in just a little bit. Um, I'm going to skip through different parts of this videos. Skip ahead here a little bit. So this is a normal, what we call spectrogram, where you're looking at the different frequencies that are present in someone's brain signals. When somebody is having normal symptoms, we're typically expecting it to be a fairly normal spread of these frequencies without any kind of unusual peaks of activity. But when somebody's having some Parkinsonian symptoms, particularly with movement challenges, we can see this unusual rise in this beta peak. So this beta band is describing the selection of frequencies that is associated with these off symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And when folks have worsening off symptoms, we have seen a correlation with an increase in this beta band signal. And that's what the DBS is trying to track is the size of that beta band to use as a correlate to the Parkinsonian off symptoms. So for local field potentials, what is the local field potential? What are we deriving this beta band? Essentially, the local field potential is just the summed up electrical activity going on in the brain where the signal is located. And it's representing the overall activity of all the neuron signals in the brain. It's really actually something that's been measured at different areas through many different types. Folks might be familiar with EEGs, for instance, electroencephalograms, where you put a bunch of stickers on the head and are monitoring the brain waves, typically looking for any kind of seizures or seizure-like activity. And so those are brain waves that you're picking up through the skull and through the skin with these electrical activities. The DBS is measuring the same thing, really, but it's just measuring it deeper in the brain, where you have this lead implanted in the area and is reading that summed up electrical potential displayed as this wave frequency pattern here. This potential is really just made up of the actions of all these little different neurons having action potentials. So the summed up of all these little spikes of activity from the neurons in the area are creating this local field potential summative activity. So as an analogy, we're often looking at local field potentials as compared with what's called microelectrode recording. Microelectrode recording are, as the name implies, very tiny little electrodes that are measuring the activity of very small amounts of neurons. And you see these like very tiny spikes of activity related to local small populations of neurons firing. In contrast, for local field potentials, instead of listening to this one small area, you're listening to the entire group summed up into one single waveform. So this waveform that you're picking up a local field potential is the activity of all these little individual groups of neurons in the area that you're listening summed up together. One thing I wanted to add, particularly for the engineers in the audience, and if there's any history with signal processing, is that we're talking about these beta frequencies and these beta bands. What we're really talking about is something called the frequency domains of these signals. When you have any kind of signal, you're typically looking at what we call the time domain, where you see how something is moving up and down as time is progresses. But you can change a signal to the frequency domain, meaning you can show what kind of sinusoidal pattern of a certain frequency makes up that signal. So you can see here there's a single sinusoidal pattern of a single frequency. So while it looks like this in the time domain, it would pop up as a single spike in the frequency domain. Similarly, if you have a slower sinusoidal pattern, it would show up as a lower frequency in the frequency domain. And then if you have these two patterns on top of each other, you can see these are two patterns of different frequency. If you put in the frequency domain, you can actually see that it's clearly just two different sinusoidal patterns laid on top of each other. Mathematically, you can actually do this to any single signal. So if you do a Fourier transform or other mathematical techniques, you can change something from the time domain into this frequency domain. And it's the frequency domain that we're looking at. We're trying to see this beta band frequency, where there are these frequencies from this 20 to 30 hertz or 10 to 30 hertz, and trying to see when there is a peak in this beta band, because these are the types of frequencies that are correlating with these Parkinsonian signals. So when there's a high beta band, that's when we're typically looking at worsening Parkinson symptoms and using that as a signal to tell the DBS that we need to turn the stimulation up to treat those. Um, Kind of similarly, there is research, not as much as the beta band, but looking at a higher frequency band called the gamma band, this 30 to 100 frequency band, that can be associated with excessive motions or a prokinetic band. In particular, there can be associations with dyskinesias for some folks. But for current adaptive DBS purposes, we're really focusing primarily on the beta band and treating these off symptoms. So, in summary, as far as clinically using these LFPs or local field potentials are stable over time. The beta band can often correlate with these clinical symptoms of a higher beta band being associated with more off symptoms. And the LFBs can correlate with therapy as well. So when you're looking at the local field potentials and the beta bands, when you have a good beta band, you can see it lower in response to medication, and you can see it lower in real time with stimulation, which we do when we're streaming the data and we're programming the DBS with adaptive DBS. And because of that correlation with the off symptoms and the uh, uh, correlation with therapy and the reduction with appropriate medication stimulation, then we can use that for clinical management for adaptive DBS. So, going into BrainSense technology a little bit further, here's the overall signal flow. So we have this raw LFP signal that's collected. So this is the time domain. And again, this is that summed up activity of the neurons in the brain. This actually isn't saved or shown on the tablet. You can actually access this later on if you need it for research purposes, but we don't actually see this raw time domain data when we're trying to program. Instead, it pops up as a frequency domain through a fast Fourier transform and shows up as this beta band calculation to show how much of that beta power is there. So when we're doing the initial programming, folks, we'll set up BrainSense. We'll have it start reading the local field potentials, and it'll throw up this frequency domain where it shows the powers of these different frequencies. And hopefully we'll show you what's the beta band, and then we will go in and look for this peak. And we can see if there's a peak that's associated with any individual given patient and choose that peak to be the one that we want to track over time and use to let us know if you should turn the stimulation up or down. Once you've chosen that individual peak, that's what the device can then measure in real time how it's changing. So this is measuring the specific beta frequency, and then it's showing here in the streaming mode when you're making adjustments, somebody's on medication, when you're having them do tasks, how high and low that beta band is going in real time. And it helps you to adjust the stimulation, it helps you to adjust the thresholds to make sure that you're having the stimulation settings where you want them to be so that your dual thresholds are on target for keeping your symptoms within a pre-specified range. And so this is another representation where you can see a 3D model of the basic ganglia. It gets very complicated, even for residents as far as the anatomy. So don't worry about the specific individual structures. But essentially where you have the DBS going into the target, into the subthalamic nucleus in this case, you can see the ability to read those local field potentials in that area and use that to inform the current disease activity of the Parkinson's and turn this device up or down depending on the disease activity. So this is really overall the main goal. This is kind of the classic sinusoidal pattern we'll see for medication effect, where somebody takes a dose, the levodopa goes up in their bloodstream, goes down, they take another dose, it goes up and goes down. And when it's going up and going down, there's these periods where it's at a good level where you have on symptoms, a period where it's at a low level where you have off symptoms, and then a period where it's at a peak level where you have on symptoms with troublesome dyskinesia. And then with really DBS in general, but also with adaptive DBS, um, the goal is to be able to track those fluctuations and correlate them with this beta LFP power. So you're trying to see if there's this beta frequency that is correlating with these fluctuations. And then when using adaptive DVS, try to adjust the stimulation to adjust the beta frequency and thereby adjust the fluctuations to keep it more in target so that somebody is in the really sweet Goldilocks spot of on time without any troublesome dyskinesias. So outside of the adaptive DVS, the BrainSense itself is nice in being able to record these ones. And typically, actually, before we even turn on adaptive DVS, we'll set somebody on BrainSense to read the LFPs to get a good idea about what their beta is looking like. And so the LFPs give a sense about if you can find a good beta that correlates with somebody's symptoms, how well their symptoms are controlled outside of the clinic. It can show LFP changes over time, where we can actually ideally see a fluctuation during the day when we're tracking these to correlate with somebody's medication timings. Um, you can actually set up events so that somebody can click a button when they're feeling off or when they're feeling on. You can see if there's a beta signal that correlates to those off and on symptoms and can provide this extra electrophysiologic marker or spreadsheet essentially of how somebody's symptoms are being controlled. Um, so when we are looking at the beta, this is what it actually looks like on the tablet. So for this is the timeline feature that we see. For this patient, he has BrainSense that's set up, and we have already set to record a certain beta frequency, likely this one peak that you can see right here. And then you can see that it's recording the power of this peak over time. This is on a single day, the 14th of October 2019, apparently. And then showing from, you can see when he wakes up at about 6 o'clock, you can see that there's this fluctuation in the beta that's correlated with a normal cycle and then with medication on and off time from there too as well. There's also some nice features, as I mentioned, you can get events in there. And if a patient records of events, it takes actually a frequency snapshot where you see the whole frequency spectrogram, and you can look for a beta signal that is correlating at that particular snapshot that can help you identify the best beta to track for somebody to make sure you're having the most accurate signal that you're following along with. And you can set up a bunch of these different events actually. So this person took a lot of events, and you can compare and contrast between, say, when they just took medication, which would be ostensibly when they might have the highest beta peak because the medication's about out of their system, versus when they're feeling on. And you can overlay these events on top of each other and look for beta peaks that are correlating with different symptoms. So a lot of interesting ways that you can use the timeline feature, the event feature, to get some more information about patient symptoms and then how it correlates to their symptoms. So again, what we're looking for is when somebody is having off symptoms versus on symptoms, if there's some kind of beta peak or signal that is correlating with those off symptoms. And then if we track that beta peak, we can use that for both adaptive purposes and then really just monitoring their symptom control there too as well. The timeline itself is just showing the power of that beta peak, but the beta power is going to be different from person to person, and really, if there's a fluctuation, it may not necessarily tell you if that fluctuation is enough to cause symptoms or to improve symptoms. And so that's where the events can be helpful. If we can have a patient mark events when they're feeling symptomatic or when they feel like they're being treated well, that gives some additional context to these beta powers and gives us an idea about for an individual patient when they're being symptomatic, when the beta is too high, when it's too low, and can really help us with both understanding their beta power and then also choosing thresholds to try and stay between when we're using adaptive DBS. Oops, one here touch. And so again, the goal is to try and hit the beta into a sweet spot where we're trying to keep it between this upper and this lower threshold, where the beta is at a good level and then keeping symptoms controlled at a good level there too as well. And BrainSense alone, even when not using adaptive DVS, which can have some savings for the dual threshold mode, um, doesn't really result in significant change in battery drain. For chronic brain sensing, longevity impacts are estimated to be up to 0.52% per year when sensing is on for up to 2 months for a year. And then with full-time brain sense, about 3% loss of battery life per year. So really a fairly minimal impact. And then particularly if you're using rechargeable devices, really not much of an impact on that standpoint there too as well. And with that brief foray into signal analysis, that is the end of the presentation. So thank you guys again for the opportunity to get a chance to talk to you guys about this interesting modality, some of the data we have, the dates thus far, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come up as far as the features, the data, or just questions about how it might be used in a clinical practice at this point.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bellows. I am going to stop sharing your screen. All right, there we go. Okay, we did have a good number of questions that have come in, and it looks like some that are still coming in. All right, so uh, let's see. The first question that we got was, how was on time determined in the ADAPT PD study?
Oh, good trial. Or yeah, for all these trials for on time, they usually go by diaries. And so they'll have people fill out diaries during this trial as part of the clinical where they'll really just fill out, do I have good on time? Am I having trouble with dyskinesia? Am I off time? There's different ones. The diary is probably the most common one is one called the Hauser diary. But it's usually by patient report with these systematic diaries that they'll check for completion as part of the study protocol that they're determining on time. And that's a very common way that they do on time for really any Parkinson's trial. So.
Okay, thank you. And when you mentioned that some people had trouble tolerating adaptive DBS, can you explain a little bit more what that looks like or what that means?
Yeah, so let me pull up my review here. In the paper itself, they mostly had mentioned that for the study design, they have people um, set up on continuous DBS, the kind of original open loop model, and then switched over to one of the adaptive modes. And there was a phase where they would set up the adaptive portions. During this phase where they were setting it up and trying to get somebody set onto adaptive mode, that's where they said that this portion of patients was not able to tolerate it. When they say not tolerate, it usually is really kind of non-specific as far as if there's some kind of side effect that limited it. We're doing DBS programming, it's often like maybe cramping or paresthesias or things like that. Or if they felt like there was insufficient benefit when they were trying to set up the adaptive DBS, such as maybe tremor that was persistent or some other symptom that may or may not have been felt to be adequately treated. But the long story short is that for this portion of the patients, they did not feel like they were able to get onto an adequate adaptive DBS program because of either side effects or insufficient program benefit before they could reach the rest of the trial.
Okay, and so what is device-related adverse effect?
That is an excellent question. It's really what the investigator and this committee that's part of the protocol deems might be related to the device programming or the settings. And it's really kind of a judgment call on both the investigator and the committee that's in there. So, for instance, in a trial, if you're checking an agent or you're in a device, if somebody has a fall, somebody needs to be like, is that related to the device or not? So did they trip on, a piece of root that was on the ground? People would say it's not related to the device. Did they have some shuffling gait and they tripped over a threshold of a door? Could the shuffling gait have been related to inadequate symptom control? Potentially, somebody may have adjudicated that as potentially device related if there was not sufficient tremor benefit. So it's this kind of judgment call about whether you could potentially call these side effects as related to device stimulation or not. It's kind of mentioned in there. There is often debate about these. Sometimes the companies are involved in these. So for some of these clinical trials, the sponsor will send off notifications about whether the company themselves feel that this is related. For this particular trial, Medtronic was not involved in the determination of whether these device or these adverse events were related to the device or not.
Okay, this presentation picked up a little bit kind of in the middle, assuming that a lot of people understood DBS, kind of what it was. But there were some questions about STN versus GPI. What are those things? What is the difference? And how does one decide where the kind of the targeting is? And then the other question that is similar, I guess, in regard to this one was related to this person maybe has a better understanding of kind of this the targets in the brain that get chosen for DBS and wanted to know with adaptive DBS, are those targets the same or have targets expanded with this improvement in technology?
No, excellent questions, and I apologize for throwing out acronyms with abandon because that's just like a medical hobby, I guess. That and switch it between brand name and generic names for medications at will. So STN stands for subthalamic nucleus, which is a target that is in this part of the brain underneath the nucleus, and is the longest used and most common target for DBS. GPI stands for globus pallidus internus, which there's a picture of it there anyway, but it's kind of like an inner layer that's a bit larger and a bit up and outside of the subthalamic nucleus. And that one hasn't been used quite as long, but increasingly for a longer time now. They're both targets for PD. They both work in the main goal of improving on time and reducing on time with troublesome dyskinesia. There are some caveats for either one as far as like which ones you can get better medication reductions, which ones you can get some more improvements with dyskinesia. But essentially, both good targets for DBS that will commonly choose which one might be best when we talk about patients at consensus conferences. For adaptive DBS, there is more data for subthalamic nucleus with some of the smaller, more preliminary trials, but there is increasing data for GPI as well. And then, particularly with ADAPT PD, this latest trial, there was data for both subthalamic nucleus and GPI. There were more STN patients than GPI patients here, but that usually just reflects that we often implant STN more than GPI as well. There's not any new targets at this point with adaptive DBS. There's definitely a lot of interesting projects, both with this LFP sensing technology and other ones looking at signal analysis in Parkinson's and other movement disorders and other nuclei, and trying to use these to elucidate what signals might be important and how we might use those to better understand disease states and ideally for adaptive purposes. But at this moment, nothing new that we'd use, and these are primarily still for the SDN and GPI targets for Parkinson's.
And so if a person had, let's say, tremor and rigidity that they were trying to improve with DBS, and they had to kind of make a decision as to which was the symptom that they wanted to be most improved, does adaptive DBS, is it just like traditional DBS in the sense that you still kind of have to make a choice, or is it more global in in the symptoms that it can help control or improve?
The types of symptoms it can improve and which target you would go after to consider about which symptoms would be the same as far as adaptive DBS versus continuous DBS. Um, so it's not so much a difference in the types of symptoms you're targeting or kind of a trade-off between different symptoms, but more how you are adjusting the stimulation in response to the signals of the brain and if you can really hit the target on time without troublesome dyskinesia at a similar rate as the continuous DBS, or ideally with an improvement, as was kind of shown with some of the secondary findings in the dual threshold mode. Um, so not so much of a difference in symptoms that you might do for DBS as well, but or for continuous DBS, but more how you're getting to that same goal. Um, and then just as an aside, for tremor and rigidity, we're usually actually trying to do both of those with DBS anyway. And really both targets have actually been shown to be helpful for both of those symptoms.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, there appears to be a slight I'm just gonna read this question, and then there's kind of a couple of questions that came in kind of a similar thread here, but there appears to be a slight time lag between the spike in the brain signal and the stimulation event. Since the device is reading the signals constantly, is there any work going on toward anticipatory stimulation?
That's an interesting question. I'll probably have to judge the meat of that question and defer that to Judd and Todd. But one thing I can point to is as far as the lag time, Part of it depends on a mode. So actually the single threshold mode and the dual threshold mode, as we talked about, the dual is trying to kind of slowly keep you within that kind of target goal between the lower and the upper threshold. So kind of by design, there's actually a slower uptrend and downtrend of the stimulation as compared to the response. For single threshold is actually much faster on the scale of milliseconds that you're seeing this increase in response to the stimulation. But it's also not just whenever it briefly causes a signal, it's actually looking for a sustained duration across the threshold, just so it's not firing constantly if there's a brief blip over the threshold, but it's really more looking that there be some kind of sustained level of the threshold before it starts to fire from there. So it's not so much that it may not be picking it up, it's more that it just may be waiting for a sustained amount over that threshold. To the brunt of the question, as far as some kind of predictive stimulation pattern to there, not that I'm aware of, but happy to defer to Judd and Todd if they have heard anything about any kind of predictive modeling.
Okay, Todd, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, he handled it so well. I think that's exactly right. We don't have a predictive model, but what's beautiful about this is when you set those thresholds, it can actually start stimulation increase before the patient actually feels it. So we get a question a lot of times, can I just do it myself on my patient programmer? Yes, you can, but with a LFP model, you might not feel that LFP rising, and it can kind of handle that before you can actually log on and actually increase your stimulation. So it can handle it before you actually feel it coming on, but it's not as involved as what the question was asking. But Dr. Bellows handled it perfectly.
Okay, so before I come so while we're on the topic of thresholds, I'll ask this question and then I'll kind of come back to a question that was related to this as well. So how do you know if you're a single threshold or a dual threshold?
Uh, so the smarmy answer is because I see it on the device when I choose it from that point. But mostly it's actually just the mode that we can choose on the programming. So when we actually set up the brain sense and you go into the options to choose it, it'll say, do you want to stay in brain sense, meaning you're just sensing and you're just, doing continuous DBS, or do you want to use single threshold, or do you want to use dual threshold? As to kind of which one is best for individual patients, that's kind of where we really can try it out with patients and see. There are some symptoms which there seem to be some thoughts that it might be better with single threshold. So, tremor is one that's being looked at for single threshold as far as like a quick response if there happens to be a increase in tremor and hopefully a concordant increase in signal with those. While dual threshold has been, kind of one that's been more studied. And as we've seen in the trial, was the one that's had some of the statistically significant benefits in on time as compared to the continuous DBS and the ADAPT PD trial. Personally, what I do is that when I'm starting DBS for somebody, after I've gotten enough signals to kind of take a look at their timeline and look at their LFP powers, I'll usually actually set up both. So I'll set up both a single and a dual threshold for folks, see how they're doing in the office clinically, see how it looks like when we're streaming while I'm trying to adjust the thresholds. And then I'll leave them as options for folks. Typically, I'll have one that seems to be doing better from a clinical standpoint, leave them on that one. And then if they notice it has any kind of waning benefit or there's some other kind of concern, then we might try to do the other version. So I might leave them on single and then have them switch to dual if they think there's any kind of issues. Single threshold, additionally, as we mentioned, can be kind of a quick increase and downcrease, increase and decrease. And sometimes people can feel like maybe a little bit of a side effect when it's growing up quickly like that standpoint. Dual threshold is going to be less likely to have any side effects. You can also adjust how quickly it's going up and down to minimize any potential side effects. So it's really just kind of going by patient to patient, seeing how they're responding, seeing what they prefer, and then giving it a time on both of those programs to see what works out best individually.
Okay, there seem to be some questions related to if it's at night and I'm sleeping and this is adjusted because I have less activity, but let's say I have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or if there's a fire. Um, like, does this, I think people are worried that it's going to, that the settings are going to change on them and then not respond quickly in a scenario where they need a quick response. So how does that adjustment work?
Yeah, I guess probably two things to clarify in that standpoint is that One, it's not that it's like turning on and turning off between these two issues. It's actually just moving between a lower and a higher stimulation between these standpoints. The other is that between these two amplitudes, the way we program it is that usually the lower limit is actually fairly close, either at or maybe just a little bit below what we would be typically using for kind of a continuous DBS anyway. And that the upper limit is actually a bit higher than what we would typically use. So that with the device, it's actually able to use the higher stim only when you need it, and thus reduce any side effects that we might have if we were kind of constantly using that higher stim. So it's not like it's turning it off at certain points and that it's not going to be kind of as effective as continuous DBS, but really more providing a fairly constant benefit and then just adjusting itself to maximize that benefit rather than just being off versus on. There would really be like a difference as far as having continuous DBS if there was some issue with getting up in the middle of the night or, God forbid, a fire or something like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. What about the battery life on this device? So is this comparable? Is less battery used, more battery used? Is it comparable to kind of, what we traditionally know or are familiar with regard to battery life? And how is the battery? Is this a rechargeable battery, or is this something that has to be replaced?
So it's pretty much about the same as what you would see with other modes. And For battery life, when they did the looking at either brain sense mode versus single or dual threshold, either there was like a reduction in up to 4% of battery life to a gain in up to 5% of battery life, but still very, small swings on the stage of things when it comes to battery life. But we typically would quote similar battery lives for folks who have non-rechargeable devices, which is, anywhere from, I typically say 3 to 5 years, but batteries are actually getting better these days. So I feel like it's actually typically beyond that. It does depend on the amount of stimulation more so. So if you're, adapting between, 1.5 and 1.7 milliamps versus if you're adapting between, 3 and 4 milliamps, there's going to be a difference in battery life just from how much juice you're putting on average between those two. It does come as rechargeable as well. And so with the rechargeable, it's actually just approved for 15 years. And so would be replaced at 15 years. And then the battery life is mostly just how often you would need to charge it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, if someone had, so somebody submitted a question, said that they had Medtronic DBS in 2024. So did they miss out on technology, or is this a software upgrade, an operating software upgrade that they can just tap into so that they can get the benefits of the adaptive DBS?
While I can't speak to any individual patients, I would say that if they were implanted in 2024, then I would put money that they probably have a Percept device that's in there at that point, since that's largely what was being implanted at that point. And that with adaptive, it's actually already on the devices. And so it just typically might need a software update if it hasn't already been updated, and then it becomes a feature at that point. Todd or Jed, feel free to jump in and correct me if so.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The more important thing is the wires in the brain. So if you have some of our older wires, prior to 2020 kind of thing, you might have wires that are not insulated and really made for sensing the brain. So, but anybody after that that's got the wires that are made for sensing the brain, the Sensite uh, leads that we call them, DBS leads, then you'll be fine. Uh, Anybody with Percept implanted will get upgraded, even if it wasn't FDA approved. It'll get upgraded as soon as Dr. Bellows puts his programmer over it. It'll get upgraded to have that ADBS technology in it, so you'll be fine.
And can you go back if you're one of those people that adaptive DBS doesn't sit well?
Absolutely.
Can you go
Absolutely.
back to what you had before?
Yeah, like patients in the trial, if they did not like the adaptive stimulation, you can just do chronic, which does really well for a lot of patients. We're just kind of always searching for that even better standpoint, and that's where ADBS comes into play.
And Yeah, like I mentioned with the groups that we put in, so often I'll include a continuous DBS group in with those. So if somebody is having issues with like a single or dual threshold, and they want to go back to continuous, either long term or until we can take another crack at it, then they can go back to the kind of standard operating mode. So it's always an option.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just going through. I just want to make sure I'm not missing people's texts or emails. Okay, so the question is this basically just the next step of traditional DBS?
It's a very interesting step. And I think once we get some more ideas as far as the place in programming, the kind of clinical benefits we're seeing, particularly with longer term and larger groups of folks with SDN and GPI targets, I think it's definitely a very interesting modality. And it kind of mirrors similar adjustments to kind of this open loop and closed loop modality where we've been doing stimulation for longer, like in epilepsy and things like that too, as well. I think over time as well, we'll probably get more research into different types of signals of interest, different ways those signals interplay and correlate with Parkinson's symptoms. Hopefully, other movement disorder conditions would be great too as well. And then as we get some more information to get other things we can track, improve our knowledge, and really kind of use that to help with our programming strategies here too as well. Which reminds me, I forgot to talk about electrode identifier, but I can mention that a little bit briefly here once we get a moment.
Okay, I can give you the floor now to mention it
Uh,
before we move to the next question.
One mild feature of here that's interesting is the electrode identifier one. So we mentioned that you're using beta to track the signal, but you can also use the beta to figure out where is best on a lead to potentially stimulate. So if you're looking at beta, the correlate, if you can find the part of the lead that has a biased beta signal, then that gives you an idea about where is a good place to target. Leads have gotten increasingly complex over time, so there's more areas we can stimulate from. While we can just look clinically how about somebody does, it's helpful to have some additional information, whether it's like image guidance or using beta to see about what might be the best one for a person's individual symptoms. So with the Medtronic device, you are able to actually use this beta reading to give you a sense about which part of the lead might be the best and most efficacious to stimulate from.
Okay. All right. And if you had DBS prior to 2020, can the brain leads be changed out? Can they be switched?
For leads, there is the option of removal and reimplantation of leads. It's something that we've classically done really just for targeting purposes. So somebody had insufficient symptom benefit or they had some side effects because the leads were a little off, then they can go in and take it out and move it in. Um, with any kind of surgery, of course, there's always surgical risks and things or what have you. So with discussing that, it's usually best to do so in concert with the treating neurologist and the neurosurgeon as far as the risks and benefits.
And so there were a couple of questions that were related to the local field potentials and how much that varies person to person from day to day or over the course of the month. And then does that vary greatly? And is the objective of adaptive DBS really to deal with those variances, or is it just to find like the base setting?
So for the variance in the beta, the beta can vary from person to person. So not everybody's going to have the same beta peak, or the same even fluctuations in those. And there's been some interesting studies for different conditions where they've seen different kinds of signals modulate differently in different folks. But for many, you typically are trying to look for a typical fluctuation pattern on a daily basis. And if you look at like kind of the timeline for these folks when you're reading the beta, you'll see a fairly, kind of consistent change in the beta during the waking hours that, hopefully if you have a good signal is, mimicking the medication on time there too as well. Um, the goal is with patients who you can find a good beta that is correlated with the symptoms to try and use the stimulation to increase its stimulation to treat those symptoms during those high beta periods, mostly as a way to help provide this additional stimulation benefit when we're reading that they might need it.
And how easily does the adaptive DBS adjust when people go through medication changes? How much do you have to go if you were to contact your doctor and the doctor said change your medications to this? Does that also require a trip back in? Or is that something that adaptive DBS is going to be able to kind of adjust on its own without a trip back in to see your physician?
So it's going to adjust on its own based off of the beta power. And so if there's a change in the beta, the adaptive is still going to adjust itself based off of that beta power. The thing that could be a bit different is if you're adding in medication changes, particularly if it's a larger medication changes, the beta can be affected by medication because that's what we're seeing with fluctuations during the day when somebody's taking the medication. So if there is a larger change, then you might need to potentially just change like kind of thresholds where the DBS is activating just to better kind of capture any beta based off of a new regimen. But the DBS would still be able to respond to those beta fluctuations that would still be present.
And is there any change in, I know that, we've come from advancement in technology now that allows for MRIs and that type of thing. Does anything change in, with regard to those parameters with this new technology?
When did you guys have the 3T conditionality?
Yeah, it's still 3T and 1.5T. So nothing changes as far as the MRI concerns at all. It's still conditional. You must have a center that knows what they're doing, and they kind of turn down the settings just a little bit. They they follow a setting that they know. I won't confuse everybody with the setting B1RMS, but yes, nothing's changing with the adaptive stimulation.
No, the 3T compatibility is nice. I guess one thing wod be if you're an MRI, you need to have an MRI mode, which you need to have a specific configuration that can be set up to be on while you're in the MRI, which would be kind of more of a standard continuous stuff at that point. But outside of when you're physically having the MRI done, then it would just be adaptive as normal.
Okay. Any greater risks compared to old DBS versus new with this? I mean, is there anything that people should be, to be thinking about with regard to this? Or is there any, aside from things like maybe cost, which, is not what they're asking about, but is there a reason for any other reason for not going the direction of adaptive DBS?
So as far as like greater risk, no, I mean, when you see these trials, they have like these AEs that are listed for all these things. But a lot of that really is more from the design of the trial and really kind of looking at how adaptive DBS is working. It's working in a very similar fashion to continuous DBS. It's just adjusting itself from that standpoint. So you're really expecting a very similar side effect profile as to continuous DBS. It's more just using that adaptability and that changeability in real time to try and hit your on-time targets better from that standpoint. And again, as we mentioned, for folks, if they, for whatever reason, adaptive DBS is not tolerated for some reason or not hit the target, you can always use the continuous DBS in those standpoints. No, it is a good option. It's, I think, one that has some interesting data for it. We'll only get some more data as time is going on. And I think it's definitely a good option from those available to see about how it can be a good option for treating your symptoms, ideally.
And can adaptive DBS be considered at any point when DBS is appropriate, an appropriate treatment option? Or are there, is this something that can only be used 7 years into a diagnosis versus 3.5 years?
Yeah, at this point, we would be using it in the same breath as continuous DBS. Perhaps as we get some more data and we see if there's symptoms that are definitely more responsive or definitely areas where it could be helpful, then we might get some more experience in those regards as a community. But we would really be talking about adaptive and continuous at the same times for, improving on time without troublesome dyskinesias, folks with higher medication burdens, and with appropriate expectations for what DBS in general can do for your symptoms.
Yeah, that's a great point. Um, okay. I think we've made it through all of the wonderful questions that have been submitted, and like I said, this program is being recorded, so it's going to take us a little bit of time to get it up on our YouTube channel, but it will be there, and we'll probably post about it on social media. But you can always check in with us, and we will let you know. And so we want to make sure that you know that that you'll have that information, and it'll be there once we get it up there. So I want to thank big thanks to Todd and Judd from Medtronic, and to Medtronic for their years of wonderful support and sponsorship. We're grateful for that as always. And to Dr. Bellows, who's a wonderful partner to us, a medical advisory board member, but also just so generously gives of his time, nights and weekends. And we appreciate that in helping us better understand all of these options. And thanks to all of you. I know we've got a watch party out there, and we've got others of you who've given us a couple of or about an hour of your time tonight and sent in some really great questions. And so good for you for learning about all of these wonderful options, and for being proactive in your own disease management. And so that's what these programs are about, and we're glad that we're able to bring this information to you. So with that, I'll let everyone get about their Thursday evening, and I hope to see people around at the upcoming in-person things that we're doing. And with that, thank you everyone, and good evening.